Spinning. Oh, that's hilarious. We are live, Sarah.
It is.
Sorry we're late. This is the first Lunch and Learn live experience. And I didn't know I had to go up to the upper right and push live to make us live. So we're on, Sarah. That is so classic. So I just want to welcome everyone who's here. I'm Kim Reynolds, and this is our first Lunch and Learn series, and it's brought to you by the Peak Leadership Experience, which is a program designed to change the world one female leader at a time. And Peak, as some of the participants fondly call it, is a 12-week online transformational women's leadership program geared towards women who want to gain more confidence, collect tools, and take their career to the next level. And the intention of this Lunch and Learn series, I want to talk about topics that really resonate with professional women and create a forum to explore these topics that are important to you. So please add your comments and give us ideas on what you want to hear us talk about. A note about the comment box. I'm the only one running the show here technically, so we will stop and pause and have moments for comments and questions along the way. And without further ado, I want to introduce our guest, Sarah Goldman, who's the program director for the North Carolina Outward Bound's professional development and virtual programs. And today we're discussing leading dispersed teams in a world that's trying to figure out how it's going to look when we all go back to the workplace, either physically, virtually, or probably a hybrid of the two. And what's really interesting to me about Sarah's current role with Outward Bound is Outward Bound is known as a wilderness-based team building experience. We teach people to dig deep through experiential challenges such as rock climbing or ropes courses. And so here we are in COVID, and Sarah has had to totally reimagine Outward Bound from a virtual perspective and has been successfully working with intact teams over Zoom throughout the whole pandemic, creating meaningful team experience in an online platform. So yay. And I understand that your program's been wildly successful. And so you've really learned firsthand what it is to lead a training for a dispersed team. And we chose this topic today because this is what her clients are talking about, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is when we think about these trainings and this work that we do with these organizations, we're addressing the needs they have, and these are the needs that they have. So I'm hearing this stuff every day.
Great. So let me introduce you, Sarah. Sarah has her own coaching practice, and she likes to focus on mindset and performance coaching. She's worked 15 years in public safety as a professional firefighter and police officer. And during that time, you served your country as a Department of Defense civilian firefighter in Iraq, supporting Operation Iraqi Freedom. And for fun, you're an avid runner, competitive endurance racer, and you believe that doing things the hard way has the most rewards. And I know firsthand that you're a girl that really goes for it. So Sarah lives in North Carolina with her dog Taco, and you can find them adventuring on the local trails. So I want to bring up a little fun fact here. Sarah and I actually met in 2008 when she attended my women's ice climbing program, Chicks with Picks. And according to Sarah, it changed her life. And we could do a whole program on that, I'm sure.
But true story.
Sarah and I also share the Outward Bound connection. I've also worked for the Outward Bound's professional development program, but I've done that here in Colorado. So we share the love of using the outdoors as our classroom and a way to build teams through Outdoor Challenge. And Sarah was also a member of my Peak Leadership Women's Pilot Program. And it's been really fun and meaningful for me to reconnect with you after quite a few years. So So I want to welcome you, Sarah, and thank you for supporting my first Lunch and Learn. This is, as Sarah knows, this is a bit edgy for me. I'll say that out loud. And so let's start with telling us a little more about your work at Outward Bound and what inspired this topic today.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me, Kim. And, kudos to you for embracing the edgy, challenging pieces of doing this, because as you know, we like to encourage folks to be outside their comfort zone. And so it's good for you to be here on the edge of yours. It just goes to show it's never stop learning, right? Never stop doing edgy and hard things. This topic is inspired by the fact that this is what's going on. I mean, this is what's facing contemporary organizations. My work in Outward Bound Professional and developing, intact teams. This is what's facing folks every day. I have the luxury really of talking to numerous different types of organizations, really all over the world at this point, which is what virtual has brought us, as a reach that we never, really had before. And like I said, we're addressing issues and things that are going on with these teams and organizations. And this is what I'm hearing about every day are, what are we going through? What are we going to be going through? So I think it's just really germane to what a lot of folks are facing right now.
And as they look at continuing to embrace this remote work and having this, partially going back to the office or this hybrid looking thing, what are they most concerned about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what I've heard, which is not going to be surprising, is, it's that uncertainty, right? I mean, it's that whole idea of something's about to change again, right? Like we've all been sort of living in this uncertainty for this, last 14 months or so. But the uncertainty now is changing as to, okay, well, now folks are getting vaccinated and maybe the pandemic is entering a new phase. And are we going back to the office? Are we not going back to the office? So I think folks have that concern again of this, like expecting, we call it like transition stress, right? That when you watch a group that knows it's about to go through something, it starts to get stressed ahead of time, knowing it's coming. So like that concern about that transition stress, right? And I also think that, that concern and what's driving a lot of that concern is this continued thought about, the work-life balance, because the work-life balance sort of got thrown out the window over the course of the last year. I like to say that we aren't working from home, but we're at home working, which is a very different feel. And so I think those challenges that we face with the work-life balance, knowing that we're going to go through another sort of work-life balance disruption, is something that's really, on people's minds.
Are there any tips you give your folks to manage that stress?
I think transparency, right? I think that's one of those things is that, being transparent in what's going on with your group and your organization. I think as leaders, folks get looked to like, what are we doing? Give me an answer, right? Like folks want to know so they can start planning. So I think being really transparent about those timelines and really intentional about those timelines too is important. Like this idea of we're not going to rush back until we have a plan, or we're not going to make a decision about what the future looks like until we have a real plan. So I think that transparency piece is really pretty important. So that's what I would suggest to help kind of manage that stress.
When you are working with these teams, what do you notice or what are they saying about how working remotely has affected their actual team dynamic?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we were just talking about this earlier, but this whole idea of like folks fall off the radar. Right. So like let's say you work in an organization that's got 25, 30 people in it, you may not have a reason in your daily workflow to encounter some of those folks, but at least you'd see each other passing in the hallway or in the parking lot or at lunch. But if you don't have a reason to meet with that person, then you may not see them at all. I know I've heard folks say, gosh, I forgot so-and-so even worked here, because they don't ever see them because they don't have actual workflows that marry. So I think that's like one effect that really happens. Obviously there's the potential for lost efficiencies. I mean, that is something that is, you can't pop over the cubicle barrier and ask a question, but you can fire off a text or a Teams chat, right? So it's really just figuring out how we like manage efficiencies differently. And I think one thing to like be aware of, and like one thing that causes a challenge, is that like the close get closer, right? Yeah. So folks who work together well and are very close, like rely on that relationship because it's comfortable and familiar, and you already had maybe really open means of communication with that person, where the folks who don't have as close a relationship, there's probably a bigger gap filling now than there even was before. So really being aware and mindful of the fact that, out of sight, out of mind is not how we want to operate, and being really apparent and recognizing that, like, the close get closer. If it's easier for me to talk to you, I'm going to talk to you more, and how that's going to affect us.
Yeah, I hear a lot of concern about making genuine connections. And in what ways do you help remote teams create meaningful connections? I just know, working for Outward Bound, you have a great bag of tricks.
Yeah.
But it would be really fun for you to share 3 of your favorite team building activities that people out there watching could use.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so this is where it gets really important to remember this phrase of connection before content. There are a lot of pragmatists out there. I think a lot of leaders and really active managers fall into that mindset of, like, we jump on a meeting and we're going to accomplish what we need to do, and that's going to be it. And we don't take the time to pause, stop, create some connection that we don't have, because we weren't all just in the office. Before I turned my camera on, I was potentially sitting at home by myself or with my family even. So pausing, taking that time to create that connection before we dive into any meaningful content is so important. And there's a bunch of ways to do that, right? So one thing that we like to encourage folks to do, and we always do in our internal meetings often too, is we start with just go around questions. I mean, this is, any opportunity where the majority of your team gets together, or whatever size makes sense. Like, literally, you don't need to do this at every single meeting you ever have, but getting on there and just throwing out some sort of go around question and then having everybody answer that. I mean, it could be as simple as that, and it could take just a moment to do. The other thing we like, suggest is to throw folks into smaller groups, like go into breakout rooms. And I say, give folks a problem to solve, right? Or an activity. Make it somehow maybe even low stakes competitive. So when they come back to the main session, there's some sort of give and take around that. You can do
have them come back and report out, you give it a little part, and then they report out each group.
It depends on what you're doing, right? So, a good example would be, and these can be things that are totally off the wall or completely germane to the work you're doing, but something that's totally off the wall, as an example, would be okay, you're going into breakout rooms in groups of 5 for 5 minutes. In those 5 minutes, you need to create a round the world itinerary as if you were on an air flight, and you have to make 4 stops. And when you come back, you have to explain why you picked those 4 places. So what you're doing is, in that small group, those people are interacting, right? They're immediately forced to talk to each other, as opposed to just sitting in a big meeting and sitting back and putting yourself on mute and just being a passive participant. We want to create that very forced active participation. So even an activity like that, think of all the things you're getting out of that. Folks it's too small of a group. You can't just sit there and be quiet, right? So you're actively participating. You're probably sharing something about a particular location and why you want to go there and why it's important to you and why it's interesting to you. You probably will end up hearing about somebody's bucket list item, which you never would have heard about if you hadn't specifically talked about it. And then also what I like to do is something like that is, if I've got 5 people in the room, I want 4 stops, because now they've got to build consensus. Not everybody just gets to pick their one, right? So now you're talking about consensus building. So having those folks come back and then report their itineraries to the big group, it seems silly, and to some degree it is. And look at all the things you just learned about people in something
like you said, those cross connections with people that they might not otherwise talk to.
Yeah.
So,
And then my next suggestion too is this idea that those are fun, those are connection building. They are useful in the way you work, but they're not necessarily directly related to your work. Something you can do that would be very much related to your work is, create what we call a full value contract with your team, and have the folks go in together creating that, where you as a group determine what you value about how you work together. Have those conversations, use a medium like Mural or the Zoom whiteboards or something like that, and really put it out there and have conversations around it. And then get consensus, get buy-in, and commit to holding each other accountable to that contract. And
what a great tool to check back in on, how are we doing with this? This is what we put out there for our team.
Absolutely. So you can see how those things go from something as silly as like, hey, what did you have for dinner last night as a go around question, to a more small breakout room type thing, to then something that's like very specific to your organization.
Right. And so you'll start a meeting with something like this, just to break it up. And I'm sure on your longer programs, you're integrating a lot of those types of things throughout the program as well.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about developing a virtual team building program, it's it's different than what I just described. These are more things that like folks can do with their own teams pretty quickly. Do things that are a little bit more, well, actually quite a bit more in depth in a virtual program, because we're designing activities that are created to elicit certain behaviors from folks so that we can draw those out and observe them and talk about them. I mean, you know the drill when it comes to that kind of work, and we can do that exact same thing in a virtual environment. We're just having to be more creative and find a different tool to do it.
So you find that you're able to create that same meaningful connection that we do outdoors that we're so used to, in that team building scenario, that you're able to do that virtually successful and meaningful.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing, right, is about creating, well, one, we're creating connection, right? Like, because we're having folks interact as people, and we want folks to like drop those barriers and drop those walls. And we've gotten the feedback that we've been able to really create not only authentic spaces, but emotionally safe places. And the reason, and the way and the reason we can do that is because, our folks that are delivering these virtual programs are outward bound instructors and facilitators, right? We didn't just pick people who are like great on camera and in a virtual environment. We took our staff, actually our staff did this themselves, where they created these lesson plans and created activities. And then we are delivering them. The same folks who are gonna send you off a swing on a high ropes course or, whitewater canoe with you are the same people who stand in front of a camera and deliver these programs. And a lot of folks will say, about Outward Bound, and this, that it's the quality, their experience is driven by the quality of the staff, right? And the people of Outward Bound are who kind of like really make those experiences. Well, we're able to bring the people of Outward Bound into every organization and every team everywhere now, because we're in a virtual space. So.
Yeah, that's so exciting. It's like, who knew? Like a couple of years ago, could you ever imagined this?
Oh my gosh,
running Outward Bound courses.
We delivered our very first virtual program in April, like the very beginning of April of last year. So we were, specifically here at North Carolina, we were really way out ahead on this. We pivoted pretty quickly, and we delivered our first program. And I remember we kind of logged off the participants, and my co-facilitators and I looked at each other and we're like, oh my God, it works. Right? Like we didn't know, we had a good idea, but it was just like, wow, okay, we can see it happening. We can see how we can create that container for that connection. Yeah. And it's experiential, right? I mean, this is experiential education, and experiential education is about eliciting an emotional and intellectual response from somebody. We can do that in Zoom. Right.
Yeah, so this is really, I think helpful for people that work in more of a corporate setting, that you can apply and do some of these within their teams as well. That just breaks it up and makes it more, fun. And I love that phrase you have of connection before content. I think that's just a general great practice. Yeah. As you speak with your clients and as we anticipate this transition, what do people need most right now?
Well, I think, again, like I mentioned, that transparency, right? That piece that like, again, like the leadership needs to share with their team, like where they're at. And that might mean, hey, we don't have a decision. We don't know, but we're telling you where we're at. And I think we need, as leaders, to provide a clear path forward for our teams. And I think that that's hard to do when there's a lot of uncertainty, but as much as you possibly can create some level of certainty with a path forward of, like, for example, we're not coming back to the office this summer, but we're planning to in September, and this is the plan, right? Knowing that we're not saying, hey, we're coming back next week, but there's, a plan moving forward, and that there's a clear path. And I think what folks need to feel is that there's some level of personal confidence that as we enter the second year of the pandemic, which is a phrase I just started using, the second year of the pandemic, that's crazy, that there's still going to be the grace offered to us as professionals that we were given in the first 6 months, 10 months of this. Yeah. So even though some of this is starting to normalize in a different way, we still are going to need that grace. And I think there's a fear building among people of, okay, things are getting ready to change again, but I still have my kid at school they're in plan B, so they're only at school 2 days a week, or their aftercare is not happening because the school's in session, but they don't have after school, so I'm still going to have childcare issues. And just, knowing, I think that folks are going to need that confidence that grace is still going to be afforded to them.
Because when you're speaking of transparency, it's not just with the worker bee, you're talking across the board, especially from leadership down, that we need to almost talk through this transition and be really honest and open about what the issues and challenges are, and more maybe check-ins with each other on how is this working and what's not working. What are maybe a few specific things that a leadership can really do to set their team up for success? You and I were talking about intentional leadership the other day.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one thing always that's really important for leaders to do is to manage expectations. I think we really set ourselves up well when we're very clear about what the expectations are. And again, even if that means, hey, we don't know what they are yet, that you're clear about that, and that we do a very good job of just being open and having folks feel like they know what's going to be expected of them going forward. I think not rushing decisions around coming back to the office, not coming back to the office, whatever it is, that it's not just a matter of like, oh, okay, great, let's do it, June 1. I think as we have shelter in place orders lifted and different things happen in different states, there might be a knee-jerk feeling of like, great, let's go back. But let's go back and let's make sure we have a plan we're putting into place when we do that, and not just, okay, we can, so let's do it, right? Or we're going to stay remote just because we can. That may not be the best option either. And then, one other thing is like, yes, we want to lean into the technology, right? There's a lot of technology that supports this kind of work. But I had a great corporate leader tell me this morning, she said, we have to remember that technology doesn't replace etiquette. Right. And that just because we have the tech doesn't mean it's going to support good decision making or support good teamwork. Right. So I think, again, like that, not rushing things, having that transparency, managing expectations, and just reminding each other of what, a good professional etiquette looks like.
When you speak with leaders and anticipating building a high performance team remotely, how can they best do that?
I think the number one thing for people to remember is that just because we're not in person, it doesn't change the entire world, right? It is still the same good principles of good leadership and good management that apply. You're just utilizing different tools to do those things. That same corporate leader who has mentioned something about technology not replacing etiquette. She was really clear that she's like, it's pretty simple. It's the simple stuff still, right? Like it's not, there are challenges that are going to be presented by communication, obviously, and some of those things we talked about earlier, but really just remembering that good leadership is still good leadership. Now we can talk all day long about what we might think good leadership means, right? And that's, I'm sure, something you're going to talk about with all your future guests as well. But a reminder, and I think what's important for folks is to get the block out of their head that this is different. And I think that's one of the things that we do in a virtual space that's so good, is that we just show up as ourselves, right? And I know that is not easy for everyone, and that some folks still very much have this this is different because I'm on a computer versus this is different that you're sitting here right next to me. But I think try and get past that block of everything's different because we're remote or we're dispersed is going to be something that you really need to kind of get through and get past.
What do you think the biggest leadership challenge is?
I think recognizing your role, right? I think recognizing your role in a remote environment, I think, is going to be important. And that speaks a little bit to some of what I just said, which is this idea, that it's not different in some ways. In some ways, there are things you're going to need to be more intentional about. And so I think one of the things that'll be hard is that this idea that you've got to be very thoughtful and intentional about building connection with your employees is something that sometimes feels I'm not going to say a waste of time, because it's never a waste of time, but feels like not the work you want to be doing, right? Like the work you want to be doing is whatever is the deliverable you've got to focus on. And so I think it's remembering and shifting back into like what it means to be a leader. And that means knowing your people. That means taking the time to connect one-on-one. And just because I can't say, hey, come by my office and sit here for 15 minutes with me, I've got to say, hey, let's jump on a call for 15 minutes. Like that's two different things.
Versus the out of sight, out of mind thing, which can so easily happen.
Yeah.
I want to bring up a challenge you and I talked about on the phone the other day.
Okay.
And it's around that communication, So it's like about the chain of communication and decision making. When you've got people in the office in person, they're right there available to discuss. And then you've got some people remotely, and we talked about how maybe they're out of sight, out of mind, and that communication chain doesn't, trickle down. How can a team or a leader really ensure that, across the board communication when we're working in these different platforms?
Yeah, so you're talking about sort of that hybrid challenge of you have some folks that are at home, you have some folks that are in the office, and some folks that kind of go back and forth between the two, right?
Yeah, to me, that could be the biggest leadership challenge we've got. We haven't quite had that combo before.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, well, one thing I always like to say too, or remind folks, is that we don't need to reinvent the wheel on a lot of these processes. There have been corporations and teams working in these environments for over a decade, if not more at this point. So I think it'll be worthwhile for folks to look at some best practices that have come out of that work. But knowing that we go forward, like there maybe not has been quite as much of the hybrid model, which I think folks are going to have kind of going forward. But I think in terms of, staying ahead of those challenges, or like ensuring that there's good communication, is that we've got to build it into the workflow, right? And this is when we talk about intentionality. And I know like everybody, that word, we throw it around, being intentional. And really it means making a plan, right? It means working towards a specific outcome. And if I know that I need to have X, Y, and Z a part of this conversation, then I create a process that creates that, right? That ensures that. And then I routinize that. I mean, this is about creating corporate habits, right? And corporate culture. And we're getting ready to like have a new culture in a lot of these places. And so I would say, create new habits and create them early, right? Like as you come back, this is why I'm saying like, don't rush things. Like make sure you have processes in place that are going to become habitual, because whatever your organization does in those first 30, 60, 90 days are going to be whatever you're trying to undo for the next 5 years, right? So it's like really being thoughtful about that and thinking about this as like creating new habits for your organization.
And to stay ahead of those challenges, you're also speaking to, you have to anticipate them. So there's that forward thinking of anticipating what could happen versus, life as we know it in the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's also, how do you build in the responsiveness to that as well, right? So like we want to be proactive. We don't want to be reactive, but there's a difference between being reactive and responsive, right? And so being able to have processes that are nimble and not inflexible, so that you can, in the moment, be like, this is not working, right? And so maybe what it is building in habit of, check-ins that are not quarterly or biannual, but are more regular, right? So that we can be ahead of the ball game with these things. And I'd much rather spend 30 minutes with somebody every 30 days going, man, things are great, as opposed to half a day with somebody a quarter in, having to undo, 120 days worth of things we should not have been doing, right? So I think really thinking about that ahead of time, because we're not going to be able to anticipate all the things that come. We'll be able to anticipate a lot of them, I think. And I think there's plenty of data out there that's going to show that. But being early in those pieces.
I really like what you're saying about don't save the check-ins for the quarterly review. And in general, part of what I love to talk about at the Peak Leadership Experience is a tool I've learned from Marcus Buckingham. And he did some research on how do you create the highest performing team. And he says, simply check in weekly. It's a 10-minute quick little check-in. You pop into someone's office and you say, what are you working on and how can I help you? So that there's connection and they're setting standards for here's where I'm going, here's what I'm working on. And I think that how can I help you, even if the person never requires help. It just shows that the leader cares.
Yeah, absolutely.
I really love that, be more. And I think in this framework, in this platform, that's going to be more important now than ever.
Absolutely. And I think there's opportunity there for not only the leader to say, how can I help you, but how can you help each other?
Yeah.
So some of those opportunities where you're creating those small meetings before a big meeting is like, hey, your question is share something you're challenged with right now and get some input from your colleagues about how you can deal with it.
Right? You know what I love about that? It's so easy in this virtual world to be in your own little private Idaho or in your little private silos. So creating a network, a way to, cross connect and help each other is awesome.
Well, right. And I think that's that idea of coming back to like cross-functional teams.
Mm-hmm.
And I know one of my clients is doing a lot of forethought, looking at how they're coming back to, they're calling it return to office, much like it was like return to learning and different things. So they're returning to the office. Their, plan is they're coming back a day a week, sort of throughout the summer, so folks can kind of get that muscle memory back of what it feels like to come to the office. But they are changing the physical built environment of what they're doing in their office, right? Mm-hmm. So instead of folks having individual offices where this is my desk and this is where I sit, they're creating hot workstations, knowing that like in the end, they're probably going to have people there a couple days a week and a couple of people at home a couple days a week. So your own little private space is not necessarily something that's useful or required. Mm-hmm. And they're, clustering their people by team and by cross function so that it's not, hey, all of like this particular group is in this room, but these people working on this project are going to be at this cluster of desks when they're in the office. Mm-hmm. So really thinking about that built environment too.
Thank you. And I'm noting the time, Sarah, and I want to open this up if the chat box is going to work. So just to be clear here, I'm using StreamYard, which is awesome, but I've never used it before. So if you got on later and we weren't here right at our start time is because I didn't know how to start the broadcast. So if you're here with us now, make a comment in the comment box. I'm just curious if who's connected. And if this made it to, professional women empowered to lead, because when I go back to that page, it's not live there. So,
oh, gotcha.
Yeah, I'm hoping it's live here on YouTube. But I want to open it up if anyone's here and connected to put out some questions, and let's see if this piece works. Oh, can't post. I see one Facebook user went like this. I got a little clap and I'm here on Facebook Live. Yay. Great. Where on Facebook Live are you in Professional Women Empowered to Lead? Do you have a question? Throw something at Sarah. What a resource. Oh, anyone on YouTube? Let us know. I love it. Technology. This has really pushed me. Let me tell you.
And this is that grace though, right? Like, I mean, this is all the things that we have to offer all of each other is, that like, as we're learning new things and putting them into place, we don't need to seek perfection.
Yeah. And it's, so I always ask my clients to, whether I'm coaching or in peak leadership experience or doing an outward bound professional, I always ask people, like, we're trying to push people's edge, right? We're trying to push out of our comfort zone to learn more about how to dig deep and, pull from resources within ourselves, maybe we know or don't know about. So this is really edgy for me. Technology is like my edge. Doing this Facebook Live for me, or this live event on YouTube is really edgy for me, and learning all this. So I've had lots of help. It's great. So I'm not seeing any questions. I want to talk about next week. So the intention with these live events is to do them weekly. Oh, we have a question, Sarah. This is so exciting. Could you speak to authenticity versus vulnerable in the check-in process? Could you speak to authenticity versus vulnerable in the check-in process?
So like when we're checking in and doing one-on-one conversations with folks, like if we're asking about how we like walk that line of being authentic and vulnerable, but still having the appropriate level of boundaries, right? So, I mean, I think a lot of times we talk about, the folks that are talking about this vulnerable leadership. It's sort of one of the new, not new, but in the last couple of years where, Brene Brown's work is really focused on sort of this daring leadership idea, and this idea of being vulnerable, and how you still have to have like a filter on that of like being wide open, vulnerable, and sharing all of your stuff is without intention and without reason is just being like crazy vulnerable, as opposed to like having those ideas where you're actually able to say something that's useful in the moment, and vulnerability with a purpose. And there's like sort of a distinction there between discharging your stuff versus like empathizing and reaching common space. I think, Kim, what you're doing right now is being really authentic and vulnerable, and saying that like, hey, this is what's happening. It's new for me, and being, vulnerable and putting it out there that you have an edge, right? Like, God forbid we as leaders have something we're not good at, right? And so being able to like put that out there and be clear about that, I think is really useful. I'm not sure if that's quite what you're asking, that authenticity versus vulnerability. But I think that is the piece, right? Is that I don't think it makes any sense and does anyone a service to pretend that like everything is normal and everything is fine all the time, when we know that that's not the case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Knowing what's appropriate, knowing what's not.
Well, and knowing why. It's really more important to know why, right? Like, am I being vulnerable? Am I sharing these things for me or for the person I'm checking in with? And am I doing it so that I can create authentic connection, which might be true, right? Like, I might say, man, I am dealing with the same stuff, right? And this is what's going on in my world. This is me being vulnerable in that way. Or I totally understand why you might feel that way, and sharing that. And again, it's like, why are you doing that? Are you doing that for yourself, or are you doing it for that person? And what purpose does it serve? And I think that's the distinction.
Yeah. Am I saying this for myself, or does it
totally
have a good outcome? Other questions? Thank you for that. And it's interesting, I'm noticing on the Facebook user, it doesn't say who it is. So I also don't know who's here today. So that's interesting.
But come back and she'll know it all in a few weeks.
Yeah, I know. Come back.
Experiential education is happening right now.
I know. Any other questions? All right. I want to talk about next week. So my plan is to do these weekly. And next week I have Teresa Redmond, who's going to talk about sacrificing to step up, being a strong female example. And that stemmed from a conversation we had the other day I said, Teresa, how are you? She says, I've got a lot going on, and feeling the sense of responsibility as a female leader to step up because there's a need for more female leadership. So talking about that sense of personal responsibility to be a role model out there. So that'll be a fun conversation. Teresa is a participant from the Peak Leadership Experience. So I tapped into you girls to get you back here to support me, and that's a lot of fun. I am going to post. So for those of you out in the audience, if you want to know more about coaching opportunities or the Peak Leadership Experience, probably the best place to go is my website, which is mindovermountains.com. And once you get on there, you can click onto the 45-minute training or go to the coaching page. And also we have a forum if you want to connect with other female leaders and have this conversation, is Professional Women Empowered to Lead. So Empowered to Lead. So I'll put that in the comment box if you want to grab those and take a look at them. And I really appreciate that people hopefully found us here. At least a few people did, which is really fun. And I want to thank Sarah for supporting me in this first lunch and lead, or lunch and learn and lead, right? There and lead. So thank you so much, Sarah. That was fun.
My pleasure. Absolutely. Happy to be here.
And I'll see everyone next week at 10 o'clock Pacific time, which is 1 o'clock East Coast time. All right. Take care and see you next week. Bye, Sarah.